So now we move into a much more conceptual part of the course, right? Where Lewis structures, of course, are going to diagram the bonding in covalent molecules. And we'll start with some simpler examples and then move into some exception molecules that are a bit more complex. So for each of these problems, I'm going to discuss the Lewis structure. I'm just going to draw them without any three-dimensional geometry. We're going to do that probably next time. So I'm going to be drawing these molecules as if they're flat. Many of them are not really flat. They have three-dimensional structures. But what's important today is thinking about formal charge, resonance structures, bond order, bond strength, and bond length. So remember that the first thing to do is to count out the valence electrons. Carbon has 4, hydrogen has 2, and each chlorine has 7. Okay, so that's a total of 20 valence electrons.